Prime Minister Mark Carney's inaugural international journey, a strategic pivot to Europe. Shortly after assuming office, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney embarked on his first international trip, a decision that raised eyebrows across diplomatic circles. Rather than following the well-trodden path to Washington, D.C., a traditional first stop for Canadian leaders given the deep economic and political ties with the United States, Carney charted a different course. His itinerary took him across the Atlantic to Paris and London, signaling a deliberate shift in Canada's foreign policy focus. This whirlwind visit, though brief, was meticulously planned and packed with high-stakes meetings aimed at reinforcing Canada's relationships with two of its most steadfast allies, France and the United Kingdom. The choice underscored a strategic intent to bolster partnerships beyond North America at a time when Canada's rapport with its southern neighbor faced unprecedented strain. In Paris, Carney engaged with French leadership to deepen bilateral ties, emphasizing shared values and mutual interests in trade, security, and innovation. The visit to London followed suit, with discussions centered on strengthening economic collaboration and exploring new avenues for cooperation in a post-Brexit landscape. These destinations were not chosen at random. They reflect a calculated effort to cement alliances with nations that offer Canada both historical kinship and forward-looking opportunities. By prioritizing these European powerhouses, Carney sent a clear message. Canada is looking to diversify its diplomatic and economic portfolio, fortifying bonds with nations that can serve as reliable partners amid shifting global dynamics. This move comes against the backdrop of mounting tensions with the United States, particularly over trade disputes that have rattled Canada's economy. Rather than adhering to convention, Carney's administration appears intent on redefining Canada's place on the world stage, leveraging its most European of non-European countries identity to forge a path less dependent on its immediate neighbor. This diplomatic debut was not just a symbolic gesture. It was a bold step toward recalibrating Canada's international relationships for a future where old assumptions no longer hold. Why Canada turned to Europe over the U.S., a response to trade tensions. When Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney opted to visit Paris and London instead of Washington for his first overseas trip, the decision was more than a diplomatic detour. It was a calculated reaction to a deteriorating relationship with the United States. At the heart of this pivot lies a simmering conflict over trade, fueled by the aggressive tariff policies of the Trump administration. For years, Canada's economy has been tightly interwoven with that of its southern neighbor, with the U.S. serving as its largest trading partner. However, this once stable partnership took a hit when the Trump administration imposed steep tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum, key exports that underpin entire industries north of the border. By 2024, these measures had slashed Canada's export value to the U.S. by more than 10%, a staggering blow to a nation whose economic health has long hinged on cross-border commerce. This wasn't just a numbers game, it was a wake-up call. The tariffs disrupted supply chains, raised costs for Canadian manufacturers, and threatened jobs in communities reliant on steel and aluminum production. For a country accustomed to viewing the U.S. as a dependable ally, the move felt like a betrayal, exposing the risks of over-reliance on a single market. Rather than weathering the storm in hopes of a reversal, Carney and his government chose a proactive stance: diversify and adapt. Turning to Europe, particularly France and the United Kingdom, offered a lifeline, a chance to forge new trade pathways and lessen the economic stranglehold imposed by Washington's protectionism. These nations, with their robust economies and shared democratic values, represented not just alternatives but opportunities to redefine Canada's global standing. The shift wasn't merely pragmatic, it was a statement of resilience. By bypassing the U.S., Canada signaled its refusal to be held hostage by unilateral policies, opting instead to cultivate partnerships that could weather the turbulence of a changing world order. In doing so, Carney's administration laid the groundwork for a more balanced, less vulnerable economic future, one where Canada's prosperity isn't dictated solely by decisions made south of the 49th parallel. Economic and strategic impacts. Canada's bold move to diversify. Prime Minister Mark Carney's decision to prioritize Europe over the United States wasn't just a diplomatic gesture. It was a strategic overhaul aimed at reshaping Canada's economic future. For decades, Canada's prosperity has been tethered to its trade relationship with the U.S., a dynamic that left it vulnerable when tensions flared over tariffs and protectionist policies. The Trump administration's levies on Canadian steel and aluminum had already taken a toll, shrinking export values and rattling industries that employ thousands. Rather than doubling down on a faltering status quo, Carney's government saw an opportunity to pivot, turning toward Europe and Asia to diversify Canada's markets and bolster its economic resilience. This wasn't about abandoning the U.S. entirely, but about building a safety net, a way to cushion the blow of an ongoing trade war and secure new avenues for growth. The strategy paid off quickly. By deepening ties with the European Union and forging fresh trade links in Southeast Asia, Canada began to see a surge in bilateral trade, with some estimates suggesting a 65% increase in just months. This shift redirected capital, technology, and resources away from the U.S., loosening the chains of dependence that had long defined Canada's economy. Provinces like British Columbia and Quebec took it further, launching campaigns to ban U.S. imports and freeze contracts with American firms, while public sentiment, over 90% of Canadians, rallied behind the push for independence from U.S. markets. Hospitals, schools, and government offices in places like Manitoba and Nova Scotia even purged American goods from their procurement lists, a grassroots rejection of reliance on their southern neighbor. This wasn't just economics. It was a calculated trade-off with risks and rewards. By reducing its exposure to U.S. volatility, Canada opened doors to new partnerships, but it also stoked the fires of a trade war that shows no signs of cooling. For Carney, the gamble is clear. Diversify now, and Canada might not only survive the storm but emerge stronger, less beholden to a single partner, and ready to thrive in a multipolar world. Defense and technology cooperation. Canada's new European alliances. When Prime Minister Mark Carney touched down in Paris and London, his agenda went far beyond trade talks. It ventured into the critical realms of defense and technology, signaling a bold reorientation of Canada's strategic priorities. In Paris, Carney sat down with French President Emmanuel Macron to hammer out a groundbreaking collaboration, a deal valued at $15 billion USD that promised to intertwine Canadian and French efforts in defense innovation and cutting-edge tech. This wasn't a mere handshake. It was a lifeline for Canada to bolster its military capabilities without leaning on the United States, a partner whose reliability had come under question amid tariff disputes and defense-related friction. The agreement aimed to equip Canada with advanced systems and expertise, ensuring its security stood on firmer, more independent footing. The London leg of the trip built on this momentum. Meeting with UK leaders, Carney explored financial partnerships and long-term strategies to navigate the post-Brexit landscape, but the undertone was clear. Defense and resilience were front and center. With Britain's own history of transatlantic ties and technological prowess, these talks laid the groundwork for a deeper alliance that could serve as a counterweight to Canada's traditional dependence on Washington. This wasn't just about hardware or funding. It was about forging a network of allies capable of supporting Canada's sovereignty in an era of uncertainty. The timing couldn't have been more telling. As tensions with the U.S. simmered over issues like the F-35 program, where Canada feared losing control of its own jets, these European partnerships offered a way out. By aligning with France and the UK, Carney's government signaled a shift towards self-reliance, tapping into Europe's industrial and military strengths to reduce the risks of over-reliance on a single, increasingly unpredictable partner. For Canada, this was a step toward a future where its defense and innovation weren't dictated by Washington's whims, but by a broader, more balanced coalition of trusted friends. F-35 program controversy, Canada's defense dilemma and NATO's future. Canada's relationship with the United States hit a rocky patch over a high-stakes defense project, the F-35 fighter jet program. This multi-billion-dollar initiative, a cornerstone of military cooperation between the two nations, has become a flashpoint of distrust under Prime Minister Mark Carney's leadership. The crux of the issue lies in a chilling possibility. The U.S. could activate a so-called kill switch embedded in the F-35 software, remotely disabling jets that Canada has poured vast sums into acquiring. For a country that's invested heavily in these advanced aircraft, the idea of losing control to a foreign power isn't just a technical glitch, it's a sovereignty nightmare. Canadian officials have voiced growing unease, questioning whether their defense autonomy is at risk in a partnership that's supposed to be equal. This isn't a minor spat. It's a potential fracture with ripple effects across the NATO alliance. If Canada pulls the plug on the F-35 deal, the shockwaves could unsettle the U.S. military dominance within the coalition. Allies might start eyeing alternatives, turning to European manufacturers like France or Germany for next-generation weaponry instead of American systems. Such a shift wouldn't just dent U.S. influence. It could reshape NATO's defense framework, pushing member states to diversify their arsenals and rethink long-standing dependencies. For Canada, walking away from the program would be a bold assertion of independence, but it's a gamble that could strain ties with Washington at a time when unity is already fraying over trade and Arctic disputes. The controversy underscores a broader tension: Canada's need to balance its security needs with its national pride. As Carney navigates this standoff, the F-35 saga has become more than a procurement debate. It's a test of how far Canada will go to safeguard its interests, even if it means challenging the superpower next door and nudging NATO toward a less U.S.-centric future. Arctic sovereignty, Canada's stand in a melting battleground. As the ice caps recede and the Arctic transforms into a geopolitical hotspot, Canada finds itself at odds with the United States over a region that's fast becoming a treasure trove of untapped resources. Under Prime Minister Mark Carney's watch, the stakes in the far north have never been higher. Experts predict that by 2050, the Arctic could hold up to 30% of the world's undiscovered oil and gas reserves, turning a once-frozen frontier into a prize worth fighting for. Climate change has accelerated this shift, melting ice and opening sea lanes, making the region a magnet for economic ambition and strategic jockeying. For Canada, which claims vast swathes of this territory, safeguarding its sovereignty isn't just a matter of pride, it's a national imperative. The tension with the U.S. stems from differing visions for the Arctic's future. Washington has hinted at asserting greater control over these resource-rich waters, a move Ottawa sees as encroaching on its backyard. Past disputes over shipping routes and boundary lines have flared up again, exacerbated by America's assertive posture under the Trump administration. Canada's government has dug in its heels, wary of any actions that might undermine its claims or allow foreign powers to dominate a region it considers integral to its identity and security. This isn't just about oil or gas. It's about power, influence, and the right to call the shots in a part of the world that's heating up in more ways than one. For Carney, the Arctic is a line in the sand. His administration has made it clear that Canada will push back against any perceived overreach, doubling down on its resolve to protect its northern frontier. As trade and defense ties with the U.S. fray, this standoff adds another layer of complexity to an already strained relationship, raising the question: Can Canada hold its ground in a thawing battleground where the rewards and the risks are growing by the day? Trump policies in Canada's defiant response. A trade war escalates. The relationship between Canada and the United States took a sharp turn under the Trump administration, with economic aggression sparking a fierce Canadian counterattack. Prime Minister Mark Carney faced a barrage of new tariffs targeting Canada's lifeblood industries, steel, aluminum, and electricity exports, imposed by a White House intent on flexing its protectionist muscle. These weren't just numbers on a ledger. They were a direct hit to Canadian workers and communities, driving up costs and threatening livelihoods. But it was Trump's audacious claim that Canada could only thrive as a U.S. state that lit a fire under the nation, transforming economic friction into a full-blown clash of identity and independence. The remark didn't just sting, it galvanized Canadians into action. Carney's government didn't sit idly by. In a swift and calculated retaliation, Canada slapped tariffs on American goods with surgical precision. Kentucky bourbon, a symbolic jab at a politically potent U.S. state, and electricity exports that power northern American homes and businesses. These measures sent a message: Canada wouldn't be bullied. Beyond tit-for-tat, Ottawa ramped up efforts to forge stronger trade alliances elsewhere, locking arms with Europe and Asia to carve out new markets and reduce the chokehold of U.S. dependence. This wasn't just about survival. It was about rewriting the rules of engagement, proving Canada could thrive beyond the shadow of its southern neighbor. The stakes escalated as Trump doubled down, hiking tariffs further in response to Canada's defiance. What began as a trade spat now teeters on the edge of an all-out economic war, with neither side blinking. For Canadians, Trump's words and policies aren't just a challenge. They're an insult to their sovereignty, fueling a resolve to stand tall. As Carney steers the nation through this storm, the question looms: can Canada turn adversity into opportunity, or will this battle with a brash U.S. leader reshape their future in ways no one foresaw? Domestic fallout in the U.S. Trump's policies unravel trust and alliances. While Canada recalibrates its global stance under Prime Minister Mark Carney, the United States grapples with the messy fallout of Donald Trump's leadership, a storm of policies that's eroding its own foundations and alienating allies like Canada. Trump's tariff wars, hitting Canadian steel, aluminum, and beyond, didn't just spark retaliation, they unleashed a domino effect at home. Inflation spiked as consumer prices climbed, a 12% surge over 2 years pinching American wallets. Manufacturing jobs in states like Michigan and Ohio vanished by the thousands, victims of disrupted trade and foreign countermeasures. Farmers in the heartland watched their livelihoods crumble under retaliatory tariffs from Canada, Europe, and China, with Trump's approval ratings in agricultural strongholds dropping sharply as a result. But the damage didn't stop at economics. Trump's administration slashed social welfare, firing over half the Department of Education staff and gutting programs for students with disabilities, leaving millions without support. Medicaid cuts stripped healthcare from 4 million low-income Americans, while veterans faced overwhelmed hospitals after mass layoffs at the VA. Social Security delays stretched to a year, a betrayal to those who'd paid into the system. These weren't just budget trims. They were a dismantling of the safety net, fueling protests from New York to Chicago as citizens demanded accountability. For Canada, this chaos turned a neighbor into a rival. Trump's policies didn't just weaken America, they pushed allies away, with Canada pivoting to Europe and Asia rather than betting on a faltering partner. Once a beacon of stability, the U.S. now looks like a cautionary tale, its internal fractures amplifying the rift with nations it once counted on. As Americans question Trump's promises, 45% of his former supporters now feeling duped. The unraveling trust at home mirrors the crumbling alliances abroad, leaving both sides of the border to navigate an uncertain future. Political and social reaction in Canada. a nation united against U.S. pressure. The spark that ignited Canada's defiance came not just from tariffs but from a single, incendiary remark by Donald Trump, the suggestion that Canada's destiny lay as a U.S. state. That statement, flung carelessly across the border, struck a nerve, rousing a nation to its feet. Under Prime Minister Mark Carney's leadership, Canada didn't just push back, it roared. On April 28, 2025, an unprecedented emergency election unfolded, a lightning-fast referendum on the country's future. It wasn't just politics as usual. It was a rallying cry, a chance for Canadians to reject annexation and assert their independence with a unified voice. Carney, freshly minted as leader of the Liberal Party, stood firm. Canada would never bend to American whims, a sentiment echoed across the political spectrum. From the Conservative Party's Pierre Poilievre, who dismissed Trump's idea as absurd, to the NDP's Jagmeet Singh, who called for barring Trump from Canadian soil, party lines blurred in a rare show of solidarity. Citizens matched this fervor on the streets, U.S. anthems booed at hockey games, flags turned away at festivals, a social movement swelling with every insult from Washington. This wasn't mere symbolism. It was a collective awakening, a refusal to play second fiddle to a neighbor whose policies threatened Canada's very existence. Provinces doubled down, with local campaigns urging residents to shun American goods and bolster homegrown industries, a grassroots rebellion against economic coercion. For Carney, this was more than a political win, it was a mandate. The election cemented Canada's resolve to chart its own course, free from the shadow of U.S. dominance. Trump's words, meant to provoke, instead forged a stronger, more cohesive Canada, one ready to face down any challenge. As the dust settled, the message was clear. This wasn't just about survival, it was about pride, identity, and a future defined on Canadian terms. The future of Canada-U.S. relations, a crossroads with global stakes. Under Prime Minister Mark Carney, Canada stands at a pivotal moment in its relationship with the United States, a once unshakable bond now teetering on the edge of transformation. The strains, trade wars, Arctic disputes, and defense rifts like the F-35 controversy have pushed bilateral ties to a breaking point. The potential cancellation of the F-35 deal looms largest, a decision that could signal more than just a snub to Washington. For Canada, pulling out isn't merely about rejecting a flawed partnership. It's a loud declaration of autonomy, a refusal to let its military fate hinge on American software or goodwill. But the fallout wouldn't stop at the border. It could send tremors through NATO, challenging the alliance's cohesion and the U.S. role as its linchpin. If Canada walks away, other NATO members might follow suit, eyeing European alternatives from France or Germany over U.S. systems they can't fully trust. This shift could dilute America's military sway, forcing a rethink of how the alliance balances power in an era of growing uncertainty. For decades, Canada and the U.S. have been defense bedfellows, their proximity and shared threats binding them tight. Now, with Carney steering Canada toward Europe, bolstered by deals like the $15 billion pact with France, that unity feels like a relic of a bygone time. The stakes are dizzying. A fractured partnership could weaken North American security, yet it might also birth a more independent Canada, less tethered to a neighbor whose policies have sown chaos. This isn't just about jets or tariffs, it's about what comes next. As Canada deepens ties with Europe and Asia, the U.S. faces a choice: adapt to a multipolar reality or double down on a dominance that's slipping away. For NATO, the ripple effects could redefine its future, testing whether it can hold together without the U.S. as its undisputed anchor. Carney's Canada isn't waiting for permission, it's forging a path that could rewrite the rules for better or worse.